not perceiving Mahaprabhu in a particular way. And so, and I couldn't help noticing quite a while ago that the principle of forgiveness was not one of the 26 qualities of a Vaishnava listed in the Chaitanya Charitamrita or by Srila Prabhupada. And so, and then I kind of also remembered, as I believe you yourself have mentioned on a previous occasion, that within the Madhva Sampradaya, there's some principle of like eternally condemned souls, which is not found in like anywhere else in like any Vaishnava theology or philosophy like that. So I'm just kind of like wondering if there's some scope for where does for if is there some scope for actually being unconditionally forgiving, or even I mean like again there's it's just a little mysterious. I wanted to get your input on this,
Mhm.
because there's some, like for example, I'm just remembering now. Like in the Chaitanya Bhagavat, some of the neighbors of Srivas Thakur, Srila Srivas Thakur, they're saying, "Oh my gosh, we can't sleep at night because of the loud yelling every night that we're hearing, from like next door or the neighbor." And then Vrindavan Das Thakur says, "Yes, such sinful atheists are condemned. They're doomed to hell, etc." I mean, it's a little, it gets to be a little, so I'm just wondering if there's scope for actually practicing forgiveness, even though it's not, apparently not given a lot of emphasis or importance in our family's ideology like that.
Mhm. Well, forgiveness is one of the qualities of the Brahmins. Um, and there are any number of examples of Vaishnavas being forgiving and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu forgiving. You referred to Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj. I don't remember exactly what you were referring to him in relation to, but what comes to mind in relation to your topic, of course, is the place that he secured for his life of bhajan um, in um, in Navadvip is there is a significance from the point of view of Gaura-Lila to his choice of place there, because it is the place where aparad is forgiven. Hmm?
Yes.
Place, I think, must have been maybe Vakreshwar Pandit or someone who had, or Damodar, somebody, I forget, offended, I think, Srivas Thakur in the context of a Bhagavatam narrative and so forth, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu forgave him. So there is a very prominent, if you will, example of forgiveness that is capitalized on by Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj also when the opportunity arose to have land there. He thought, I'll go there where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has exhibited this attitude of forgiveness because um, who needs it more than me? He thought in his humility. So there are any number of examples of that. And and I would say it is a prominent feature. Um, but I think also that you may be, um, we may find many examples where forgiveness is not given because it's not yet warranted. Hmm?
Hmm.
Um, um, so it may be a fault on our part to forgive people for things that they do, um, when it would be better for them to be chastised for it. Hmm? And then if they ask for forgiveness, well, that's another thing. Then we can give it. So you speak about unconditional, forgiveness. I think that's a very broad kind of a perspective that one could um, drift towards, if you will, outside of the context of really being involved in the world or in the dissemination of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, establishing what the teachings are and so forth. It's kind of an extreme Mahabharat internal kind of perspective. Everything's okay. Um, no one's at fault except me, something like that. And there's no, from that perspective, or within that state, if you will, of consciousness, there's no discrimination and perceived necessity to correct anyone, and so on and so forth. But from the Madhya point of view, and certainly when someone's writing a book, they're typically writing it from a Madhyam perspective. In other words, discriminating, setting out what's correct, what's not correct, and so on and so forth within the teachings, which is what, for example, Chaitanya Bhagavat is. Well, it's a book, so Vrindavan is writing a book there. And so it's not particularly, an uttam expression. And within the Madhyama perspective, then there is that discrimination, and those who are inimical are avoided. Now you can say, well, avoided is one thing, but criticizing them and sending them to hell, is another thing. Well, it depends on the temperament, I would say, of the particular devotee, how they're going to overtly react and what they may say. But it's not necessarily the case that when they may overtly react to what they may say and verbalize, is how they would, is the entirety of how they feel necessarily. So I would say that Vrindavan Das Thakur is a very generous and broad-minded and forgiving individual, but he is in a foundational position establishing the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in a different culture in the midst of opposition to the beginning of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's dispensation. And he expresses some frustration with how people reacted to it negatively rather than positively. Of course, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, with regard to his strong statements, like a kick on his head with shoes, type of statements, which were echoed by Prabhupada at times, he looked at that as a compassionate expression, given the idea that indifference is worse than chastisement or reprimanding someone, because the reprimand or the chastisement includes within it a sense that one cares enough about someone to take the time to correct them, to condemn them, in strong language, and try to bring them, around, so to speak. So he looked at it in that way, and I think that you have to try to enter into the times in which that book is written, the culture, and so on and so forth, compared to now, and sensibilities of the day as well. That's another factor. But there, as I say, there are many examples of forgiveness. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Nityananda Prabhu forgiving Jagai and Madai, even as they stoned him, and these are highlighted. So
Yeah.
I think I wouldn't be alarmed by Vrindavan Das Thakur's statements at times. He's a bit feisty. There's no doubt about that. But certainly a well-wisher and a kind-hearted, compassionate Vaishnav.
Yeah, the quote by Guru Maharaj that I was referring to earlier was the way he explained that when Vrindavan Das Thakur says that he'll kick on someone's head, then that opens up another channel of mercy where the Lord says, "Oh my God, my devotee said that to somebody. Now the Lord has to go and console and comfort that person who Vrindavan Das Thakur said that to, and said, please forgive my devotee," and it kind of Guru Maharaj said that it kind of opens up another channel of mercy or connection between the offender and the Lord, like that.
Yeah, I remember that now.
Yeah.
Vrindavan Das is maybe his, you could say, his Sakya sensibilities are coming to the surface, and those boys will exaggerate about things.
Ah. Yeah. So just like
Yudhavira,
Yeah.
rasa. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to conclude my question with something like a right, relevant, and practical, and in the moment on the earth. Um, Suppose like somebody that we have loved, like like in just like a, you know, like like in a relationship in the world. It could be a family member, a friend, maybe another teacher or something. We have some loving relationship with someone in the world, and they kind of like make a passing remark, which is unfavorable towards a Vaishnava. I mean, there have been friends that we've had, like from previous missions, who've made an unfavorable comment about Guru Maharaj, or perhaps there are those who make unfavorable comments about Srila Prabhupada, like that. But we have some kind of appreciate love and appreciation for them already established prior to that. Is there some way that they can be forgiven? I mean, of course, I'm not talking about someone who has like an anti Prabhupada blog or an anti Guru Maharaj blog, or not like that, but just like a passing remark, occasional or something like that. Can they be forgiven without oneself? Can they still be appreciated or loved without oneself being considered, like a new offender to the realm, so to speak, like that?
I think from a distance, you can appreciate them for other qualities and so forth, and in their standing as a devotee. But it's a little hard to digest that someone who you loved has responded in a way that is very unloving in relation to someone whom you love and who's helped you. Given the examples that you've given, so I know many devotees, like that, and there was times I felt a little stronger about them when these issues, for example, of vilifying Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj were a little more raw and in play, so to speak. Now, over so much time, many of those god brothers, for example, of mine or god sisters have realized they were wrong without addressing that fact. I would say, reading Sridhar Maharaj's books, and they still think they were probably right from some kind of a political, managerial perspective, and and they would probably emphasize that, and not that Sridhar Maharaj was wrong or evil or the teachings were bad, or so. So they've come to a better position, so to speak, on their own because time, has told um, and revealed, their mistake, if you will. Um, so, the time is different, and I don't look at them as strongly, but with as much. Well, I don't look at them exactly the same way as I have in the past. Let's put it like that. I guess I could say more forgiving, although I think that for their own sake, they need to come a little further along and acknowledge what happened, and they would be much better off. Um, but I don't have a chance to meet them. I don't interact with them or anything like that. But that's how I feel about them. So this is my own way of responding to it. So I guess it would be a little bit individual how you might want to respond.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking about this is because it feels viscerally, not just theoretically or philosophically, but viscerally, it feels as if when we carry around like like ill will or ill feelings, or like unfavorable remembrances of others, we're suffering. We even if the person may have passed away, let's say, we still go on carrying around that, harboring the ill will against them for just some passing comments that they made and like that. So
Well,
it
it's not a good
just
idea. I mean, people, suffer from ignorance and misconception and so on and so forth. But it's probably better to focus on our own shortcomings. And I think if we do that, then it's harder to criticize anyone. Hmm?
Right, right, of course. Of course. Okay.
Cure
Yeah.
Doctor, cure thyself. It's a
Yeah,
good,
of course. Of
good
course,
adage.
yeah. Thank you, Marge.
I forgive you.
Jai.
Sumati has a follow-up question.
Okay. I forgive her too.
Thank you. Guru Maharaj, it's interesting because Bhakti Rasa and I were talking a lot about forgiveness yesterday. And so it made me remember the story in the Bhagavatam, first canto, chapter 17, when Maharaj Parikshit comes across Kali beating the cow and the bull.
Uh-huh.
Bull, who has done this to you? And the bull will not point to any particular person. And in the commentary, Prabhupada goes on for pages about, a devotee sees everything that happens as a gift from God to help him grow in his, spiritual understanding and to become more responsible. And then, so I was thinking, like, sometimes within the Sangha, devotees may inadvertently hurt one another, or somebody may do something and other people look at it the wrong way and then exaggerate it, and that person's kind of ostracized. And where is the role of, it seems like forgiveness should be a really important part of our spiritual growth. We have to forgive ourselves. And it seems like we have to forgive ourselves in order to be able to forgive the faults of others. Like you were saying, look within, and then you won't be so interested in looking at out and seeing other people's faults. But, we're all capable of horrible, sinful acts. And all human beings.
Mhm.
I
So
just,
you don't have a question, you're just making a comment.
I'm asking about the role of forgiveness and should
I think it should be in the forefront. Forefront of everyone. We should be very generous with one another and forgiving and so forth. And it's not, as I say, it's not hard to do if you seriously reflect on your own position. And if only people knew what you were really like, then and you're blessed in one sense that they don't, in another sense you're not, because then you enable yourself to continue and perpetuate or continue to act in ways that are less than ideal. And so I think it should be very much in the forefront. Prabhupada used to give the example that you shouldn't criticize someone for being dirty when they're in the shower. So I think that should be, prominent. Krishna himself makes a statement about his devotees who may be even worthy of criticism. He even uses the word sudarachar. Durachar means bad achar, behavior. But he says sudarachar, very bad behavior. They may act like that sometimes, but still, they're my devotees. So I look at them differently because they're properly situated, and whatever those problems are, they're superficial. They aren't anywhere near as substantial as is their connection with me that they have forged and sacrificed for, and so on and so forth, and which is central to their lives. So you have to look at a person centrally rather than superficially. The same thing is given in Upadeshamrita, where Rupa Goswami speaks about devotees who may have blemishes mentally or physically that should be overlooked in light of their inner reality, faith, commitment, and so on and so forth. So the latter should take precedence and should enable us to come together and be a group, if you will, despite differences, faults, shortcomings, and so forth, on the basis of the higher thing that we have in common. That's the basic idea. It's easier to do for some than others for different reasons. But as I always say, well, we respect everyone and take as much distance from them as is necessary to do that. If you need greater distance in order to respect them, take greater distance. But that should be the basic guiding, principle, if you will. And forgiveness, falls within that as well. And the other part of that, of course, is who am I to judge? It's to condemn. It's not for everybody. To criticize is not necessarily for everybody. Someone can do that effectively, constructively, and bring about a good result. Not everyone can do that. And then if we try to do that, well, it may be counterproductive, and it may also not help the person who we criticize, and it may not help us. So.
And if the person who's being criticized is not changing, and the other devotees aren't on a level high enough to think, oh, well, that's something maybe that happened many, many years ago, and this person I have to give them the opportunity to grow beyond that. And, we're on a spiritual journey, not a material trajectory. But that person continue to be ostracized. So they just see that as, well, this is coming from Krishna to help me, in some
Well,
way.
that would be a good way to look at it, but ostracization is a pretty strong position to take in relation to a devotee. Temples are places for people who have problems to come to. People who have faults are supposed to come to the temple, not the pure people. Pure people don't need the temple. It's the people who are not pure who need the temple and need association and so forth. So often it's put the other way around. It's backwards. So yeah, that's I think that is very kind of central. Actually, it's missed. It's a point that's often missed, but it's very central to Gaudiya Vaishnavism, spiritual life in general.
It behooves all of us to open our heart, and like it was Srila Sridhar Maharaj said, we don't
Yeah, I mean, a
see
person who has a particular issue or problem or whatnot may be better encouraged to and even intimidated, if you will, to improve by generosity than by lack of that. You can, by the lack of that and ostracizing, to use your term, someone, for example, from a sangha or from a community, yes, they're left with trying to reflect upon that in the way in which you mentioned, say, it must be Krishna's arrangement and so on and so forth, but they're in a weak position there without that kind of sangha and so forth, and it's difficult for them to take advantage of the ostracization and look at it in a positive light and turn it into something. And should they do that, who on the other side is going to acknowledge that that's happened? They don't even know him. They don't even give him an opportunity, or her. So, that's whereas on the opposite side, as I say, embrace such a person, say they apologize or something or whatever, then you embrace them and allow them in, and then you're very, very generous with them. That is a very powerful means to correct them. People are so nice to you, they're so accommodating. It's difficult then for you to, not want to change, given how kind they have been and generous in their dealings and so forth. So something to think about.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Another question.
So I'd also just like to say this is the last question I have. So if anyone else has any questions, just message me and let me know. So this question is from Gayatri. So she says, okay, if we have all gone through millions of species and lived out all kinds of desires to then finally come into human life, how is it that we still have so many desires left and sometimes even go back into another life form to live out a particular desire once again?
Who asked?
Gayatri.
Uh-huh. Well, I think that, our teaching is that human life is rare, and we see that practically, that among so many species of life, humans are very few. There's more on the end of my finger, than there are, many times over humans in the world. And that's just one, type of whatever bacteria or something, type of invisible to the naked eye of the human species. So humans are very, very rare, and they're rare also in terms of the consciousness that surfaces in human life, because it's a reasoning consciousness, it's a questioning. I often give it, refer to it as the why of things and so forth that's coming to the fore, a qualitative kind of question that is relative to consciousness. The natural world unto itself won't ask why. And when we ask questions of how to function within the natural world, those are questions that the natural world, if you will, can provide answers to. So it's rare in a couple of senses, but it's also said to be, it's a place from where one can go up or one can go down, and it depends upon the kind of association that we keep. So it's not that human beings have arrived at the position that they have, and upon doing so are finished with all animal desires or propensities. That's hardly the case. We're kind of an animal that's been let out of the cage. Okay. So, you've been caged up. Now we think, okay, we'll let her out now, but that doesn't mean that your animal tendencies and propensities may not or will not get the upper hand. They may. You may bite the hand that feeds you. It's possible. So these, if you consider that you're coming to human life out of animal life, so the animality is part of humanity, and spirituality on the other end of the spectrum is something that you have the opportunity for. So it's one thing to have an opportunity for spiritual life that the human life affords us. And it's another thing to acknowledge that, well, human life is part of the animal world at the same time. And the time spent in the animal world and having come from there is quite a bit longer. And the habits and the trajectory that we have, if you will, is actually one that's been going in the opposite direction of spirituality. So that momentum is difficult to turn around, which speaks to the power of sadhusanga. If you really understand it, to change the course of that trajectory is not an easy task. So there's a lot of power in sadhusanga to change the course and put someone on the course then towards spirituality. But it's not going to happen, as I say, overnight. And people can make offenses, and it's not because now you're a human being, and you can never make a mistake again, or you do it all the time, right? So use your common sense and understand human life properly. It's a great opportunity, but opportunities aren't always fully taken advantage of, or take time to take advantage of. So it shouldn't be surprising that we may abuse a good thing. That's always possible. And it happens. So we see people, what can you say? You see people acting like animals. Bhagavatam refers to them as dvipada pashu, two-legged animals. We see that. Now, we try to set a better example and give them afford them teachings and insights about a better course to take and so on and so forth. But you can bring a horse to water, as they say, but you can't make it drink. So it's complex to the trajectory of every human, their karmic background and so on and so forth. It's impossible to sort all that out. But it seems quite understandable and reasonable that people might go backwards rather than forwards. There are ideas out and about that arose as the Western spiritually minded communities started to interface with the West and possessed, as it often is, with its entrepreneurial, nature, if you will, try to improve on everything from the East. And then they present ideas about reincarnation, for example, in which, well, everything's always getting better. It never goes backwards. So it's always getting better, Well, it may sound good, but it's not something that is found in the text where the concept of reincarnation is first brought to light. And you can't just discard parts of it because you don't like it and so forth. And neither does that perspective measure up to our experience. We experience people going backwards. We experience people in human dress acting like the animals they will be in their next life. We experience that, and we experience the opposite too. Those will be saints in their next life. So it's a middle ground. It's Earth is sometimes the Bhumandala bar. It's described like that as a place from which to go up or which to go return back. Both sides are pulling on you, right? So good association, that's important, because without good association, there's plenty of bad association. there's no shortage of that, right? To pull on you. I hope that helps. Are there any other questions? I guess that was the last one, a little early, but
Kanu Ram has some.
Kanu Ram, okay.
Good morning, Guru Maharaj. My obeisances to you. I had a couple of questions this morning. I was reading Chaitanya Bhagavat, and it talks about how Lord Chaitanya's wife Lakshmi Devi was situated like in a position like of love and awe and reverence.
Who?
And I was Lakshmi Devi,
Uh-huh.
and how she would hold Lord Chaitanya's feet sometimes for hours. And I was just thinking about that, and I was thinking so much about how what Lord Chaitanya comes to give is love with intimacy. And I was just thinking about her position and of course how glorious she must be. But can you describe a little bit about why somebody like that appears in a mood with awe and reverence for Lord Chaitanya?
Yes, because Lakshmi Devi has that bhava, that is her sthayi bhav. And that's why, for example, the consorts of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Lakshmi Priya, who then passed away, and then Vishnu Priya, there is eternal consorts in Vaikuntha as well. And there is a form of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in Vaikuntha, aside from Navadvip. But the question is, who do we find in Gaura-Lila that does not have that kind of reverential relationship with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as Gaur Narayan, but sees him as Krishna himself internally from Madhurya Bhav, and that's of course Gadadhar Pandit. So Gadadhar Pandit is the Radha of Gaura-Lila. So there you find the lack of the reverence that you're talking about, but you can't change the sthayi bhav of Lakshmi. Lakshmi is there with every manifestation of Krishna, every avatar, right? Excuse me. And so that's her nature. She's massaging the feet of Narayan, Gaura-Narayan. So there she is, right? That's her place. You can't expect her to act in relation to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the way that Gadadhar Pandit will, from a Madhurya Rasa perspective, or the way that Nityananda Prabhu would from a Sakya Rasa perspective. So those aspects of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, those are some aspects of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Leela. And there are other aspects, obviously. It's the internal reason for his descent and all that to do with the Braj Bhakti and so forth. But externally, if you will, he's also the Yuga avatar, right? Now, peculiarity of that is that he wove together the Yuga avatar and praying and garlanded the world with it, very special. But that side of him is there. That side is called by Advaita Acharya, who is the Mahavishnu, through whom the avatars, Yuga avatars come, and so on and so forth. So there's a place for that for Lakshmi's perspective, and there are some devotees that may worship Chaitanya Mahaprabhu like that as well. Sometimes we refer to him as Gaura-Narayan, right, rather than as Nimai Pandit. Does that help? Lakshmi Priya ki jai.
Jai. Thank you, Guru Maharaj. Can I ask one more?
Yeah, you can.
So there's another question, like around that same chapter, Lord Chaitanya is going to Bangladesh with some of his students for preaching and gaining wealth. And it talks about how like Lord Chaitanya is a teacher of grammar, but like seems like culturally, like grammar wasn't like the big topic. That wasn't like what would really like win you respect and everything in the Navadvip area time. Do you have some ideas like why grammar rather than some other subject?
Well, language is more important than you realize, perhaps. It's a very complex thing, and what is its relationship to humans and consciousness and so on and so forth. But it's a basic part of education. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu taught Sanskrit grammar, but he demonstrated at times that he knew much more about the language than simply grammar. A simpler grammarian could not have defeated Keshava Kashmiri, who composed 100 songs, verses in praise of the Ganga spontaneously with alliteration and so many ornaments, literary ornaments and so forth that Mahaprabhu could all of which Mahaprabhu could understand, and even found some fault in two of his verses that was surprising to the Keshav Kashmiri, because to even remember one of the verses at all would have been hard, or to speak of find a fault. So he knew more, but this was his occupation. And it's kind of a Madhurya perspective. I mean, it's an intimate perspective. He's a teacher of grammar. Went to East Bengal to get some more students. So it's a typical way. One of the typical ways in which a Brahmin would maintain himself and so forth. So humble occupation as a grammarian, if you will, a teacher of grammar. He's seen as such. This is part of the Madhurya aspect of his, of course, of his Leela. Of course, he was very extraordinary in that regard. And as I say, it was apparent that, he knew more than that, but, and that came out at times. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much for, well, what do you mean about his Madhurya side? If that's a Madhurya aspect.
You seem to be asking like, well, he only was a grammarian. Why didn't he have a bigger, he's God, why didn't he have a bigger, a more prestigious job or something like that? I'm saying, well, this is part of the Madhurya aspect of it. Yeah, he's God, but Krishna's God too, but he was just a coward boy. You could say, well, why wasn't he a prince? Why would, obviously you can't, it's hard to believe he's God. He's a coward. Well, think again, right? So that's what I mean by Madhurya. It's sweet that he was a teacher of grammar. All right, anything else?
Yeah, there's a few more questions. So Bhajan asked, Pranam Guru Maharaj, could you please explain the relationship between vaidhi-bhakti practices and the development of raga bhakti?
Who's asking?
Bhajan.
Halo, słyszycie mnie?
Yes.
Tak, słyszycie
There
mnie
are a couple of
dobrze?
ways to understand vaidhi-bhakti.
Okej. Wiem, co jest
One way
źle.
to understand vaidhi-bhakti
Jeszcze raz się zaloguję,
is
okej?
that it is a type of spiritual practice, the manifestation of bhakti, in pursuit of love of God in awe and reverence. So the goal, the sadhya of that type of sadhana would be to attain mukti in Vaikuntha, in the worship of Narayan, for example. That is bhakti, vaidhi-bhakti unto itself. And it is driven rather than by just spontaneous love, like we see in Braj, by the scriptural mandates that say, you should not do this, you should do this, you should be a devotee of Narayan because he is God, and these are the reasons that he is God. And so the motivating force, if you will, is kind of a love that is dutiful. It should be done. It's the right thing to be done. And therefore it will be done. And what should not be done, that should be avoided, and so forth. So that type of bhakti is governed by these type of scriptural directives, right? Now, the other idea of vaidhi-bhakti is a approach to bhakti that is aimed at the ideal of the Ragmarg in Braj, but the practitioner inspired by that ideal does not have all the qualifications required to tread the marg. For
Nie wymaga
example,
wszystkich kwalifikacji, które są potrzebne, aby przemierzyć tą ścieżkę. Na przykład raga marga jest wewnętrzną medytacją. W kontekście tej medytacji jest spełniana lila seva przez praktykującego.
So Bhava-bhakti, there's still a type of sadhana that goes on.
Jest to rodzaj...
Now, to engage in that type of lila seva internally in a meditative body prior to attaining Bhava-bhakti or ruchi and asakti, the very higher end of sadhana bhakti, is difficult, if not potentially, in the worst case, even counterproductive, producing a misunderstanding of it and so forth and so on, or giving rise to a neglect of things that are more important that will call one's progress. So because adhikar, eligibility, is lacking in one who has had good association with the Ragmarg ideal and has that ideal, one needs to grow in terms of eligibility. And so one of the aspects of Rag Bhakti explained by Rupa Goswami are to engage in vaidhi-bhakti. That means that previous to the description of Raganuga Bhakti and Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Raganuga Sadhana is a long description of the angas of vaidhi-bhakti and the practice of vaidhi-bhakti. So when Rupa Goswami is speaking about Rag Bhakti, he says included within it is the embrace of basically all of the angas previously mentioned of vaidhi-bhakti. Not that one has to embrace all of them, but they're, but that's a whole lifestyle. They're angas that pertain to the mind, the body, speech, and so forth. It's really laying out a very comprehensive lifestyle, if you will, even while one anga may take precedence over another, and you could become perfect by any one of the powerful angas like hearing, chanting, and so on and so forth. Some of them listed there are sub-angas of principal angas and so forth. But other than a couple of them that are not favorable themselves, for example, the worship of the queens of Dwarka, that's not conducive to attaining the Ragmarg. So that type of that anga is not followed, but otherwise, so many are embraced. And Rupa Goswami says, again, this is one of the central features of Raganuga Bhakti, embracing the vaidhi-bhakti, means those expressions, angas of vaidhi-bhakti that have already been given. Now one embraces them, but not with a view to attain reverential love in Vaikuntha, but with a view to attain greater eligibility on the path of Rag Bhakti in pursuit of the ideal of Rag Bhakti. That means to follow in the footsteps of the inhabitants of Braja. And to have a kind of love that is driven, by that, but the kind of spontaneous in nature that doesn't depend upon, for example, the scriptural fact that Krishna is God. It doesn't depend upon that. Now, prior to having full eligibility, obviously one's practice is going to depend to some extent on knowing that Krishna is God. So there is sometimes vaidhi-bhakti, as I'm speaking about it now, that term is also used to speak about someone who was on the Rag Marg, by way of that being his or her ideal, but lacks full eligibility to incorporate all of the practices that Rag Marg includes. Jiva Goswami, on the other hand, has referred to this type of Rag Bhakti that is lacking in a very central feature of Rag Bhakti, means a taste that drives one's practice, rather than the knowledge that the scripture says you should do this, you shouldn't do that. But obviously, if you're driven by a taste rather than what should be done and what shouldn't be done, well, your practice is going to be more natural, easier to follow, and so on and so forth. But if you have that ideal, but you don't like the taste, then you need more eligibility to get the taste. So he refers to that as ajata ruchi raganuga bhakti. Raganuga bhakti without ruchi, which is kind of like an oxymoron, because what raganuga bhakti is about is ruchi or lobha. The same idea here, a taste, practice driven by taste rather than by scriptural mandates. You should do this and you shouldn't do that, which would constitute a dutiful type of love. We're not in Rag Bhakti, in Braj, they're not serving Krishna out of the sense of duty, but just out of a sense of love. So it's a very extraordinary ideal. And it's easy to be captivated by that if you hear about it through good association and so on and so forth. But to be captivated by the ideal and associated with someone who has that type of taste and so forth does not necessarily mean that you have all the adhikar to pursue the same path. So that you do vaidhi-bhakti with that ideal in mind, excluding some aspects of vaidhi-bhakti that aren't relevant to that ideal. So that's how we should think of vaidhi-bhakti. And it can, therefore, in that understanding, be said that we do vaidhi-bhakti to attain Rag Bhakti. But again, it has to be qualified, as I've qualified it, distinguish what do we mean by vaidhi-bhakti there in comparison to vaidhi-bhakti as a path unto itself. Does that help? I hope so.
I hope it. Yeah, I think so. Hopefully. Do you want to go to the next question?
Sure.
Okay, so this is the last question I have. And it's from Michael. And he says, I've been studying some other walks of faith as a way to understand them better and be more compassionate towards others when sharing Gaudiya philosophy. I feel it helps me understand Krishna in different ways. Is this all right as a newer devotee? And what advice would you give in how to approach other faiths as a Gaudiya?
Yeah, for the curious mind, I think that is a good idea. I think that it should, if you do that with proper association, so it would only strengthen your faith. And I think that Hinduism really speaks about some very universal kind of principles, gyan, karma, bhakti, if you will, that you'll find to one extent or another in other traditions, and identifying those ingredients, if you will, or approaches to God within other traditions will be helpful. Of course, we live in times where it is, I think, conducive to have a pluralistic perspective. There were times, for example, that Sajjan referred to when he spoke about the writing of Chaitanya Bhagavat and establishing of the Chaitanya tradition in Navadvip at that time. That's one thing. Now it's 500 plus years later, and it's a very different world, if you will. And even within the last 50 years, it's very different for Gaudiya Vaishnavism with Prabhupada, how he looked at things and preached at the time which he came to America, where he was like breaking ground and so on and so forth, is one thing. We look and see how Bhakti Vinod spoke about Gaudiya Vaishnavas and how he related to other paths and so forth, and we find a more universality there. And so both sides are, part of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, depending on the time and the circumstance and so forth. In the beginning, it may be time to, focus exclusively on Gaudiya Vaishnavism and avoid other paths, but then to strengthen our faith over time, it may be useful to explore other paths to some extent and see the common ground and so on and so forth. And I think that would be useful also in terms of attracting people to Gaudiya Vaishnavism, having a pluralistic kind of perspective where you realize there are other spiritual paths and there are other approaches to one extent or another to transcendence, and people are on them, and that's what's how things have come to them. So let it be. And meanwhile, set a good example and grow it in your own understanding of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So while there may be a place in the beginning to be a little more approach with what are those horses used, on their eyes, they don't look at the side. I forget what it's called. Focused like that.
Blinders.
Blinders, okay. And then there may be time to take the blinders off, and then there may be another time to put them back on again. We see that in the life of Bhakti Vinod. In the end, he put the blinders back on again, and he was just exclusively engaged in bhajan, and he made some statements like, if you don't like Radharani, then don't come around me. So that's coming out of bhava. In the beginning, it won't come out of bhava; it may come out of a necessity to concentrate on what the actual teachings are, get grounded in them, and get some experience in their tradition through practice. And having gotten that experience and so forth, well, then Prabhupada used to give an example that if you plant a tree, you want to put a fence around it to protect it. But over time, if it's healthy, it will overgrow the fence itself, right? And be able to touch other places and interact with other traditions and so on and so forth in a way that will be conducive to itself and not harmful. There's a stage where it may be harmful. So you have a nature like that. You're an intellectual, educated type of person. So I think that's fine to do and good. And I would include it as part of exercising your head to strengthen your heart. Use your head to strengthen your heart, something like that. Hope that helps.
We did get a response from Bhajan that was a helpful answer. But
very good. All right. Well, we're just about out of time then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Thanks, Guru Maharaj. I see someone say, oh, that's Bhajan saying, okay, listening to your talks about Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, so the answer that you gave today, pretty much a shortcut to the study, okay? Michael says that was a perfect Maharaj. Well, okay. Guru Bhakti is sorry for having technical difficulties. Madan Mohan is, he was too. Then he muted the original. Anyway, I'm just looking at the notes here. All right, so nice to talk with you all, and I hope to be with you next week. Gaur Premanande.
Thank you so much.
Haribol.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.